I'm tempted to put the microphone in here just to show it can be done, but I'm not going to tempt fate. Just to appear superior at the start. Okay, so I'm going to start by telling you two stories. So the first story is set in Sand Creek, Guyana in South America, and it was told to me by Jane. So Jane is an American, and in 2014, she went to Sand Creek to teach English in a secondary school there. Now, Guyana is an underdeveloped country. There's a lot of small villages, and it's very difficult for the children in those small villages to access education, and the girls in particular. So Sand Creek Secondary School was designed so that the girls from the villages could be moved there and be boarders, so they'd have the opportunity for an education. So Jane had been in Sand Creek for a very short amount of time when something strange happened. A girl was missing from the class one morning, and now this is a boarding school, so she should really have known where everybody was. The class was a little bit reticent to say where this girl had gone, and ultimately all they would say to Jane was that Granny had taken her. Now Jane inquired from the teachers later where the girl had gone, and she was told that the girl had fallen ill and that her family had come and taken her home to the village. A couple of days later, another girl is missing from the class. A week or two later, another girl, and then another girl, and another girl. Now, at the beginning, Jane assumed that these girls had something like malaria or a tropical disease. But the recurring thread through the story was the sort of repeated declaration that was becoming more and more ominous, which is that Granny had taken the girls. The teachers were very secretive. This was a story they didn't want to tell and which unfolded slowly. Jane realized they didn't have malaria, and what she was told by the teachers was that, in fact, the girls had started having seizures. And they eventually revealed to her that Granny was not the sort of kindly old matriarch that Jane had assumed in the first instance. In fact, behind the school there were mountains, and this community believed that a spirit lived in the mountains, and this spirit was called Granny. And they believed that one of the girls must have done something to upset Granny, so that Granny came to the school to punish the girls. So what actually happened to them is that each went into a sort of frenzied state and had to be locked in their dormitory. And then they developed convulsions. And the only way that they could be cured is if they went back to the village that they'd come from. Now, I'm going to come back to Sand Creek in a moment. I'm going to move on first to another story, and this one's set in Kazakhstan. So this is Lubov's story. Lubov is in her 60s. In 2012, she went to a party which was for the Day of the Care of the Elderly. I've discovered that Kazakhstan has a lot of really interesting celebration days. They have a day called the Day of the Doctors. They have a Day of the Elderly. So this was the Day of the Elderly, and there was a party. And Lubov was aware that a few people at the party were feeling ill, but these were older people. She wasn't necessarily surprised. She was one of the younger people. When she went home, she herself felt a little bit ill, so she went straight to bed. The next morning, her husband couldn't wake her. She was just unrousable. He called an ambulance. There was quite a good hospital in the region, so she was rushed there. She had brain scans, she had lumbar punctures to look at her spinal fluid, she had blood tests, everything was normal. She was unrousable for a week. She stayed in hospital for a full week, and then she just woke up, she was fine, and she went home. Shortly after that, similar things started happening to lots of people in the village. So people started presenting in waves to the casualty department. Some of them, like Lubov, were falling asleep and couldn't be woken. Others had things like headaches, dizziness, hallucinations. All of them had completely normal investigations. Some of them were helicoptered to a bigger town if they were particularly sick, and the tests there were also normal. This was a mining town, so the assumption was that there must be some sort of poisonous gas that was causing this. So they got in experts who tested the water, they tested the soil, they tested the air, they found nothing. They took samples of hair and nails from the most affected people, and again, they found nothing. Between 2012 and 2016, 187 people were affected. In 2016, it just stopped. Now, I'm a neurologist, and I practice entirely within the Western convention of medicine. And what a neurologist would say about these two outbreaks is that these were outbreaks of mass hysteria. So in other words, these were outbreaks of physical symptoms that have a psychological cause, but where they are transmitted through very confined communities by fear and rumor. So in the case of Sand Creek, the fear was of a spirit living in the mountains. And in the case of Kalachi, Kazakhstan, it was of poison gas. Now, I want to just make sure that people are aware. I mean, hysteria, many people think hysteria is a thing of the past. It very much is not a thing of the past. It's just been rebranded. So hysteria would be physical symptoms that have a psychological cause, and very often seizures are involved. The reason we don't hear of it much now is because we call it different things in order to avoid the stigma of the disorder. If you would like to find outbreaks of hysteria, then if you just Google mystery illness, you'll find dozens of them. If you look in medical literature, you'll look at medically unexplained symptoms, psychosomatic disorders, functional disorders, dissociative disorders. So what we do when we don't like the stigma attached to something is we change the name. I work as a neurologist, and 1/3 of people who go to any neurology clinic have physical symptoms that are likely to be psychosomatic, and some of them are really minor, and some of them are very severe, like blindness, paralysis, things like that. The stumbling block always with talking to people about psychosomatic disorders or trying to convince a patient they have a psychosomatic disorder is the disbelief that the mind can be that powerful as to make you believe you cannot move your legs at all, or that you're having seizures. I mean, to those people, or to anyone thinking that way in the audience, I say, you just imagine men in the audience, a thing called shy bladder syndrome. You can't pee in a public urinal. That essentially is your emotions closing your urethral sphincter. So basically, if you can believe that, I don't know why you can't believe you can't move your legs. So basically, you think about the footballer who can't take a penalty in front of a crowd because the scrutiny of the crowd affects his motor coordination. Or you think about the way people's hands shake when they're nervous. I think my voice is shaking now, which is one of my psychosomatic symptoms. So these are obviously all not disorders, these are not serious medical conditions, but these tiny provocations can produce these symptoms so instantaneously. We just heard one from Aaron, actually, when he was running scared in the field. They all had a period in which they can't remember, so we would call that dissociation associated with fear. So these things are really common. As a neurologist, of course, we like to always explain things according to a mechanism in the brain. For a long time, these things were just mind disorders. Now we say they're mind-brain disorders. So something psychological is producing a physiological change in your brain. You can see that physiological change on brain imaging, so you can show the change in the connectivity of the brain that produces the symptoms, so you can prove that these disorders are real. But I've been caring for patients like this at home for a long time in London. I've recently started traveling around listening to stories like that of Jane and Lubov. And that was when it really kind of reminded me how reductionist neurologists are when they just focus entirely on the brain when considering these disorders, because we're leaving out this absolutely enormous piece of the puzzle, which is society and culture and the part that it plays in this. So our brains essentially are cultured organs. They do not exist in a vacuum. If you imagine your brain is just a sort of featureless lump of clay on the day that you're born, and every experience you have is imprinting itself on that clay so that your brain is gradually forming over a very long period of time into its eventual adult form. And I always think that language is a brilliant example of this. So basically, I was born with the capacity to speak any language, but I only heard English in the early years of my life. I can therefore easily hear and pronounce English. I spent the last 24 hours trying to learn the word for water in Georgian. I'm now going to attempt to say it, and I apologize. Skali. Was it even close? Oh, maybe I'm not as handicapped as I thought, yeah. I mean, that was really difficult, actually. I was hoping the word for wine might be easier. But basically, so, you sort of, when your brain is developing, it's quickly strengthening connections of the things that it's experiencing, and it's pruning away connections of the things it doesn't need. And that means that when it comes to expressing distress, culture decides what will upset you, how you will express that upset, where you will go for help. I think it's interesting that sort of both patients and doctors are cultured beings. So this isn't just about patients, about me as a doctor. So the first time I heard the story of Sand Creek, I applied the word superstition to the spirit granny who came down from the mountain. Now, I'm Irish. I grew up in a very Catholic community. I went to convent school. There was actually a house full of nuns lived next door to me, and we used to have to go to Mass in their front room. Now, I'm an atheist now, but I've never once applied the word superstition to the spiritual beliefs of the community I came from. I only apply those words to the spiritual beliefs of others. As a doctor, I am also highly uncultured, so I've always believed that the Western style of medicine is superior. It's the scientific form. Now, it may be that if you're talking about high-tech operations and drugs for cancer, that might be a reasonable thing to say. However, when you come to issues like behavior, psychology, and psychiatry, it isn't necessarily the case. In those sort of disorders, you really need to take a sort of cross-cultural view. You know, and by that I don't mean that you should be just culturally sensitive. What I mean is you need to understand the deep-seated influences that affect the way people express distress. So a couple of quick examples. In Korea, there is a disorder called fire illness. Fire illness manifests as a feeling of burning all over your body. If you go to a doctor in Korea with fire illness, they will understand that that's actually a metaphor for a sort of burning pain of social injustice. So it's kind of a way that people can complain without having to actually voice the complaint. Similarly, in India, there's a condition called sinking heart syndrome. It's where you get kind of odd feelings in your chest, and it's often associated with feelings of failure. Now, Western doctors tend to be take symptoms very literally. Whereas really, if I started doing scans and tests in patients with those kind of complaints, really I wouldn't be hearing what they were telling me because I didn't know their language. I think it's very important for us to realize that our brain does not exist in isolation, that it extends into the environment. It was something that Erin mentioned earlier, but I'm just going to mention a thought experiment suggested by David Chalmers, a philosopher, which is basically, he says, you ask two people to go to a supermarket. One of them is healthy, and they're able to go and find their way there without difficulty. The other person has dementia, so you have to write on a piece of paper the directions to the supermarket. So what is that piece of paper? Well, that piece of paper is serving the same purpose for the person with dementia as the brain and the mind is for the person without dementia. So our brains are extending into the environment, and our brains are taking cues from the environment about how to develop. So when it came to the girls from Sand Creek, and I thought about what I would do if they were referred to me in my clinic in London, I would refer them to a psychologist, and then what I would probably do then is encourage them to stay in school because they're my values. That wouldn't have been the right thing to do. So when I learned more about the girls, they came from these very small villages that had a very specific sort of kinship structure in which the girls and the women tended to stay within the village. They cared for the houses and the land. The men interacted with the outside world. The schooling that the girls were getting in Sand Creek Secondary School was absolutely useless to them in their home environment. What's more, by being in the school, they were not learning the practical skills that they actually needed when they went home. So Granny was serving a very important purpose. Granny was basically allowing them to express their distress. It was giving them a voice. And Granny was also a face-saving way for the girls to go home. Then just coming back to Lubov's more complete story, which is also enlightening. So she went to live in this town called Kalachi in the 1960s. And it was a town that was specially set up to run a uranium mine that was close by. Now, this town had special privileges from Moscow. So there were only there were 3,000 people lived there, but they had a cinema, they had 2 kindergartens, they had a cultural center, they had a brilliantly stocked hospital. They were in Lubov's words, this town was paradise. The shops there, these were Soviet times obviously, the shops there were stocked with goods that you couldn't get anywhere else in Kazakhstan. So during this period of her life, in her 20s up until her 50s or so, she was living this absolutely incredible life compared to other people in Kazakhstan, and she raised her children in this environment. Then the Soviet Union collapsed. Then shortly after that, uranium mine closed down. Suddenly this village is essentially an unemployed village. One by one, it starts losing all its services. By the time it got to sort of the 2000s, they had no running water, they had no heating, and they had no hot water. Now, oddly enough, this is not when Lubov got sick. There was hardship throughout Kazakhstan at that time, and these people were used to hardship, and they were able to weather hardship. So they didn't mind staying in this village. But then in 2012, when there were less people there, the Kazakh government decided that they would generally prefer that these people just be moved to a town that had all the normal facilities. I don't know what the thinking was, but I'm assuming they didn't want to keep trying to supply facilities to a dying town. This caused absolute chaos in the village. This was the village that these people considered a paradise and where they had raised their children. They didn't want to leave. And that's when people started falling ill. When Lubov finally moved to her new home in her new town, she told me that she just sat on her sofa in this sort of much smaller flat in a town that no one could ever call a paradise. And she just burst out crying and thought, well, thank God that's over. And then she never got sick again. So basically, the point I really want to make is that you really can't judge behavior or psychological well-being just by looking at the brain, just by looking at the mind, that you really must place a person in their context. And finally, just in the words of the physician William Osler, it's much more important to know what type of person has a disease than what type of disease a person has. Thank you.